Welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files. Hello, Louie.
Hello, Matthew.
How are you today?
I'm the same as I always am. Thank you for asking.
Well, I have to feign some kind of interest, don't I? So,
well, I could say I've been having a row with my girlfriend for the last 24 hours, but you know, no one's interested in that.
That could be on the next episode.
It could well be.
But because I believe we do have a guest today. Tell me who's joining us.
Luckily, thanks to our technological prowess, we have managed to pull in a special guest today, who is Dr. Andy Martin, who is a writer and an academic, and he's going to chat to us about, well, I guess it's going to talk to us about whatever, because he likes all manner of topics, but I guess existentialism is one of the things we're going to chat to him about today. Do you want to say a few words about yourself then, Andy?
Hi, guys. I found myself quite distracted by the notion of you having a row lasting for 24 hours with your girlfriend.
Oh my God.
I mean, I think all these things are potentially interesting. I hope it's just not my sort of tabloid imagination that's speaking there. But
I hate you. Go and kill yourself.
No, is that a row? Is that a row, or is that just general instruction?
Quite
The funny thing is, I mean, I'm a psychology PhD. My partner's a psychiatrist. I mean, you know, this is the kind. People might think that, you know, intelligent, qualified people aren't horrible to each other, but no, we are pretty good at that.
An explosive combination, by the sounds of it.
Indeed.
Well, this is something we can discuss about in this episode, because I mean,
let's offload. Come on, Louie, tell us all about it.
No, I mean, you know, women. I mean, that's all I'm going to say. Women.
Right, she's probably saying men. So
yeah, and I mean, no offense to any of our female listeners.
Right,
you know,
none at all.
But yeah, no, but men, you know what I'm talking about. Is all I'm going to say there.
And she's probably not saying men. She's probably just saying Louie.
Louie, yeah, she's saying Louie. Anyway,
you know,
so
you asked me to say a few words about myself, which is it's kind of very open question. So I should be able to give you a kind of, you know, free and easy answer. But I suppose the funny thing is how increasingly we're being asked to, you know, say a few words about ourselves, you know, in self-description. And example, you know, Facebook self-description or something like this. This kind of thing where you know, you used to fill it in your passport form, you know, say what you are, and I always had difficulties with that, and I still do actually. So when you ask me that question, it doesn't exactly cause me to sort of flip, because I give you some sort of handy answers, but at the same time, I sort of feel any one of those self-descriptions is a little bit unsatisfactory. But I suppose I could say I'm a guy who participates in podcasts from time to time.
Well, because funnily enough, Andy, I was thinking, because a lot of your independent pieces are you do quite a few interviews, or you chat to various people, and I wonder, is this an unusual experience then, being chatted to as the topic?
Well, you know, it's very much a kind of to and fro, isn't it? So no, it's absolutely fine, and you know, when I don't really conduct interviews. But maybe a bit like you guys, I sort of, you know, have conversations, and then just, you know, let it go where it may, and you know, follow the argument where it leads, that sort of thing. So they're pretty open-ended, and I tend to go in without an agenda, and just you know, to hang with people for a little while and see what they have to say for themselves. And some people have got a bit of a spiel. Not everyone does, and I try to sort of skip over the spiel if I can. So, in fact, one of the things I was thinking, just, you know, when you called, is, my God, I don't have a spiel. I need one. I'm gonna work on that. I'm gonna develop a spiel one.
You don't have a spiel, Andy, and
no.
It's showing. No. But in terms of our listener.
Yeah.
We may have out there.
Yeah.
In terms of so you have an academic background. So in terms of just giving a context and I recognize absolutely you're already into these existential questions of who are you and what's your identity. These are all kind of questions we dip into throughout the podcast. For our listener out there then, so your background as an academic would be in what area?
Well, I suppose since there's a little bit of a philosophical swerve here, I should probably mention, because I once did a radio program on this. My mentor, if that word makes any sense, was actually Jacques Derrida in Paris in bygone days, in the sense that, you know, I studied with him. And I was doing a thesis at the time. And in his typically deconstructionist way, he managed to lose my thesis twice. And then he finally read about, you know, one paragraph, and which I thought was, you know, quite nice of him. And he commented favorably on l'humour britannique, I remember, which, and he explained actually for those, I don't think this is recorded in any works on deconstruction, that he said that really he would have liked to have been a stand-up comedian himself, but he was very, very bad at punchlines, which is why he ended up as a philosopher. He never knew when to stop the joke, basically. Hence wrote books several hundred pages long.
I mean, I was going to say, I don't speak a word. I mean, I did French at school a little bit. I mean, as far as I got was le bonk. I'm thinking that was rather funny. And calling my brother un cochon. I think that's about as far as I remember.
I can see you're a bit hazy on gender there as well, actually, but it's a minor detail.
I mean, you know, I just thought it was funny. Like looking at rude words in the dictionary when you're a child, isn't it? You know.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's probably the kind of thing that Derrida used to do, actually. You know.
I mean, kids
like phallogocentrism. I mean, you know, you look that one up. That's quite rude.
But I mean, I was having this discussion the other day. But kids don't really need to do that anymore, do they? I mean, Wikipedia and I mean, Pornhub.com or whatever the website. I mean, you don't need to look up sex or.
No. You don't need to look up rare words. I mean, one of the things I found myself doing for the Independent recently is coming up with their word for the day. Because sometimes they get stuck and they ask me, oddly enough. So I come up with the occasional word for the day. Is that of any interest to your listeners, actually?
Yeah, of course.
What's your most recent word for the day? Do you have a word for today?
There are two that spring to mind, because there's one that's a definite feel-good word, and there's one that doesn't feel quite so good in a way. But I can give you. Do you want to start with the good one or the not so good one?
You get to choose.
Okay. Well, look, the high point. I was hanging out with a classicist in New York recently, and she gave me a word direct from the Sanskrit, which I didn't know before, which is mudita, but it's going into English, Mudita, because I think I'd been talking about Schadenfreude, which is one that everyone knows, where, you know, you're feeling good about someone else feeling bad. But mudita is apparently where you feel good about someone else feeling good. And because that's such a rarity in our culture, you need to resort to a different language entirely, in this case Sanskrit, in order to find a word that can actually cover it. So it's like an intense feeling of joy at other people excelling or doing well or feeling good about themselves. And the idea is that if you're a teacher, then you automatically should feel some kind of mudita rather than resentment at someone doing quite well. So I thought that was quite a good word.
Excellent word.
It was unknown to me, so it's worth thinking about, actually. And it's kind of almost like an opposite in a sense to Schadenfreude. But okay, the other word that kind of killed me somewhat, which I'd forgotten about, was reminded of, and it somehow sprang to mind, was, hold on, I need to reconstruct this in my head. Apotemnophilia.
My goodness. Apo?
Yeah, that's right. Apo plus temno, which I think is to cut, or I cut. And then philia, of course, fondness and love for. And it actually corresponds to a desire to cut your own limbs off.
This is more of Louie's area.
Right, yeah. This could well be. I mean, it is a relative rarity, but I know that neurologist, if that's the correct term, Ramachandran, took an interest in this, where he started off working on phantom limbs, where you imagined limbs that weren't there, that had already been amputated. And he shifted from there to those people who wanted to amputate limbs that were in fact there. And that's apotemnophilia.
I love it. Now put them both into a sentence. The same sentence.
Well, even though you suffer from apotemnophilia, I might experience mudita when you chop your arm off, just because you're feeling good about it.
Absolutely. This podcast is nothing if it's not educational.
Well, there you go, and that's why that's why Andy's the the serious academic, and you're at Bucks
Absolutely,
University.
yeah. Steady on. Although interestingly, tracing it back to Andy, then to you, in terms of telling us about your own background, you still have to use this kind of a very roundabout way to almost not telling us about yourself. So I want to go back to your. So you name dropped Jacques Derrida. I mentioned that he would have wanted to perhaps be a stand-up comedian, but can never come up with a punchline. So instead of philosopher, do you think that somewhat describes yourself as well?
I don't know, actually. Let me think. I mean, I would like to describe myself as world champion surfer, actually, but I suppose that would be incorrect. But that would be my fantasy self-description.
Is it the Speedos, Andy? I mean, yeah.
What? No, it'd have to be the baggy shorts. I would prefer to the Speedos, in fact, given a choice. But yeah, I guess academic. I mean, it's tricky. Yeah, writer comes in. I mean, the thinker, and also a question of philosophy, really. I mean, the trouble is when you use philosophy these days, it tends to imply a kind of slightly, it can sometimes be a slightly arid technical discipline, shall we say. And, I like to think, not there's anything against arid technical disciplines, but, I'd like to think of it as a little bit more freewheeling and open-ended, and so therefore just something to do with clear thinking would be good.
So I mean, Andy, open-ended and freewheeling, I mean, that's kind of your writing style, isn't it? I mean, I've got your latest book, I believe, The Boxer and the Goalkeeper, about Camus and Sartre. I mean, that's freewheeling and open-ended in a way, isn't it?
It is, and without wanting to be too academic and pedantic and punctilious about this, that is not technically my latest book, and far be it from me to wish to correct anyone in these matters. However,
I stand corrected.
My latest book was actually a kind of collaboration with the great thriller writer Lee Child, who lives in New York, and it's called Reacher Said Nothing. And so putting on my slightly highfalutin hat, I would describe that as a study of the creative process. With another highfalutin hat, I would describe it as the best biography since Boswell's life of Dr. Johnson, in the sense that it just has a series of conversations, rather like Boswell hanging out with Johnson in London. So I hang out with Lee Child in New York, but basically do the thing which you may recall, I don't know if this struck you, but it struck me when I went back to Boswell's life, that although he talks about his writings and he rates him highly, nevertheless, he never stops to watch him write. So he sees the two things as completely independent, as one might, the conversation over here in pubs, let's go and have a drink, or let's go to this dinner party, and so on. And on the other hand, the writing, which is done in some sort of sanctum, religious sanctum, which cannot be transgressed, and so the thing that I found frustrating about that was not watching Johnson at work. So I did this thing where I'm watching Lee Child at work, where I'm sitting a couple of yards behind him, watching him write a novel of his, which is a novel called Make Me. So the subtitle of my book is Lee Child and the Making of Make Me. So I followed his book from the beginning through to the end. And there is a connection to bring in the book that you mentioned, Boxer and the Goalkeeper. There is a connection with Sartre and Camus, which I can tell you about if you would like me to.
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. It's just that it struck me when I was doing that book, and after I'd done it, and I was thinking back to an essay that Jean-Paul Sartre had written about Camus' great and well-known book, The Outsider. And The Outsider, famously, is a short novel. I think it's only 30-something thousand words. And Sartre's essay is quite a long essay as these things go. It's 20-something pages. And of course, he didn't actually know Camus at the point that he wrote that. And then he met Camus subsequently. And it occurred to me to think, well, of course, those 20 pages, very interesting. And it is a good essay. Draws attention, for example, to his use which you will recall, Matthew, of the passé composé, which you studied at school and so on, and its philosophical significance in this work. But the thing is that he never asked Camus, okay, what do you think you're doing, man? You know, when you wrote your opening sentence, or indeed the last sentence for that matter, rather than, because, contrary to Roland Barthes' statement, the author is not dead, or many authors, of course, are dead. Some are dead, some are not dead. And it struck me that, the ones who are still alive and kicking, you could go and have a word with them and see what they think they're doing. And at least, compare it with what you think they're doing. Even if it's not, the last word, it is a word. So in this particular case, I thought, well, it's too late to ask Sartre, Camus, what do you think you're doing, given that they are dead authors? So I thought I'd try and come up with a live one. I came up with Lee Child. I did think of asking Donna Tartt, but she takes 10 years to write a novel. So I thought it'd be, it's a bit too long to hang around watching her do that. And Jonathan Franzen, Martin Amis, I'd like to say I called them up and they weren't available, but I didn't. I went straight for Lee Child just because I thought he was an interesting guy. And he said, oh, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's do it. I'm starting on Tuesday. So if you want to get going, you better get your ass over here. So I just did it.
So you didn't know him before then? You just thought he's an author you like and thought it would be interesting, contacted him and just see what he would say?
Well, yeah, that would have been totally from zero. It wasn't quite from zero, because the funny thing was, this is quite unusual, and I suppose this has started the conversation. You know how if you write a review of a book, you just write it and it, goes out into sort of vacuum, or you might get occasional responses, but I actually wrote a review of one of his books. I forget which one now, and for the Independent. And lo and behold, he actually sent me a nice message back saying, "Oh, that was a cool review. Thanks for that." And you don't often get that, actually. In fact, that's the only time I can. Well, you might get a fuming letter, diatribe written to the newspaper or the magazine, denouncing, in this case, Andy Martin as a complete damn fool who should not be allowed to read another book in his life, that sort of thing. But you very rarely get oh, Andy, yeah, okay, cheers, man, that was cool. But in this case, I did. And so I sort of knew him a little bit. And in fact, I had interviewed him. So I kind of had his contact details. So I just winged off this totally tentative message, because I thought, although it was an interesting experiment, watching someone else write a book, beginning, middle, and end, I didn't think anyone would actually sign up for it, because you'd think, well, hold on, this guy's going to really put me off my stroke, kind of thing. There's a whole essay about that, isn't there, by Coleridge, about the man, the person from Porlock knocking at the door when he's trying to write Xanadu, and it completely puts him off his stroke, and so the poem was unfinished. That's his story anyway. Don't know if it's true, but you tend to think along those lines. Whereas, when I said this, like, the person from Porlock knocks at Lee Child's door and says, "Oh, come on in, you can watch me write this novel." And that was me. Yeah,
because there is something. I mean, because I know, Andy, I've read quite a few of your independent pieces, and you are interested in what it is to be a human being, aren't you? I mean, I think that's not incorrect.
That seems fair.
And there is something strange about narrative, creativity, isn't there? I mean, I frequently in my, I write a little blog, and I frequently, say thanks to me and the unconscious machinery of my mind, because I certainly didn't write some of these things by myself,
Right. No, that's right. Was that a statement or was that a question?
I think it was. I think I was trying to get your opinion on what I just said, rather than anything.
Bouncing it back.
Yeah.
Well, there are all sorts of mysteries there, aren't there? I very rarely thank my own unconscious, just to compare notes with you there for a moment. But I can see how one might want to doff the hat occasionally. But I do like the idea of a certain kind of rampant spontaneity, and to some extent I got that from Lee Child, without wanting to obsess about his methodology and suggest it's the same as my methodology. He is a guy who probably doesn't have much of a spiel either, and when he starts writing a book, I mean, I don't know how you are with this. Indeed, even when it comes to a blog or coming to an essay or the articles I write for the Independent, for example, I try not to map it out too much. And Lee Child's the same. So when he starts a whole novel, which is 100,000 words, and he tends to write thrillers, and most people who write thrillers kind of map them out and have a pretty good sense of where they're going, or indeed have 100 post-its stuck on the wall to do with character and plot lines and so forth. He just kind of launches into it with nothing better than perhaps a very hazy image in his mind, or maybe an opening sentence, or possibly a title, and then sees where it will take him. And I rather like that. So it requires a kind of blissful or sublime confidence to get the whole ball rolling. But you are, in effect, relying on your unconscious, I guess, in the sense that, well, just to linger on the case of Lee Child, because he is my go-to, example of the moment, actually. He will, not that I'm recommending this, by the way, let me stress this, but okay, when it comes to drug taking, marijuana, smoking in particular, Lee recommends this because he wants you not to think too much. I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because one needs to think clearly. At the same time, that there's a level at which if you think too much, you get tangled up in your own thoughts, and you need, to quote him, to get over yourself. And I think, or to sort of transcend the self at some level, in order to write fluently or fluidly, I guess, actually. And okay, his line on marijuana specifically is it shouldn't be legalized; it should be made compulsory. It's not necessarily a view that I share, and there may be other ways of achieving that, but certainly having to kind of loosen your brain up a little bit, rather than go into cogitation overdrive.
And I'm reminded of the line that I think is often perhaps wrongly attributed or wrongly said to perhaps Hemingway. Is it him which is the write drunk, edit sober? Is that him?
Can you just say that again?
I think there's a phrase, write drunk, edit sober. And I think it's often attributed to Hemingway, but I think then I've read elsewhere to say it's probably not true that he said that. But this idea of in the writing process, you need to kind of be a little bit fluid and not be too much centering yourself. Yeah. And then separately, editing, you need to have a very different mindset. And maybe, as you're suggesting, or as Lee Child was suggesting, some kind of drug, something that helps you to just, as you use the phrase, get over yourself. Yeah. Some way of putting that to one side so you can at least get it out there and then decide to edit it separately.
I quite like that Hemingway statement, because it sounds a bit like him, because it's very compact, of course. And he had that idea of the 6-word short story. That was his idea, wasn't it? The micro story. Do you remember that one?
I don't know that one.
Yeah, he came up with a story which was 6 words long, because he thought, oh well, you should be able to come. It was something like, oh God, what was it? Let me see if I can get words. It was something like, baby shoes for sale, never used. Something like that.
Yeah, no, and we're supposed to cry, aren't we? Because it's that.
I know you're resisting.
I'm torn up by the idea of. I mean, the baby fetishist, and he doesn't want his shoes anymore.
But this idea of creativity, setting aside babies for a moment and thinking more in terms of artistic genesis, it is an interesting one, and there must be these kind of conflicting imperatives. One, of pure creativity, a bit like the surrealist, automatic speech or whatever it was, where just let it loose, and on the other hand, that that critical thinking where you're or rethinking, as you say, editing, where you're trying to straighten out those initial rather fluid thoughts. But and of course, most people get either too much of one or too much of the other. And if you have too much of the critical, then you just say nothing, because you're too self-critical, I suppose. There's this terrible austerity, real degree zero of writing, where you write absolutely nothing. But presumably there's some kind of creative tension between those two, which is established, which works well. The thing about editing is, it's I don't know. I now have different thoughts about editing. I'm not quite sure, but by the way, may I say, my editor at The Independent, yes, she is a wonderful woman. On the other hand, one does hate editing sometimes, and Lee Child in particular. All right, it has power, but You and I probably, if we write something and then the editor comes back at us, as I had not very long ago, but 34 pages of recommendations of things, you might go, oh well, okay, yeah, that's interesting. Leachart, in his sort of super powerful semi-Napoleonic way, tends to say, okay, you can give me 3 suggestions, I'll take note of one of them. It's just because he refuses the, actually I remember one of his lines, okay, it's in my book, Reach Said Nothing, where he had hardly written a word. In fact, I think he'd written the title or the name of the file at the top of the page or something. And he turns to me and says, okay, this is not the first draft. And I said, okay, what is it then? He says, in this slightly kind of, you know, action hero, slightly gruff way, it's the only draft. Like, nobody messes with my sentences, sort of thing, actually. And although that's slightly, you know, football hooligan-esque, I kind of approve of that, because it you know, shows you're not going to sort of, you know, rethink everything or let someone else rethink.
And you can overthink things, kind of overcook the meal.
Yeah.
I mean,
True.
and spoil it. I mean,
that is
and
right.
there is a lot of dross out there, isn't there? At the end of the day, I mean.
Well, something I occasionally run into, and this is not specific to any immediate colleagues, but you know, there's a certain academic routine where you feel as though you have to tip your hat to, you know, all the right people. And I can remember, well, actually, it's a book not a million miles away from Boxing the Goalkeeper, where I had a fellow academic knock on my door and complain and indeed, you know, denounce the entire work on the basis of not having a proper bibliography. And so this question of apparatus, I mean, does everyone want to rewrite their damn PhD? This is a question. And of course I didn't. And I deliberately wanted to ditch bibliography, which if you do a proper job could be as long as the book itself, needless to say, talking about those 2 particular philosophers and a few others moreover. So where do you stop? And since a lot of these things are now archived and available, I deliberately wanted to you know, ditch the archive to some extent. And maybe, I don't know, this is a question you guys might have asked yourselves, you know, in the sense that now everything seems to be automatically archived, and, you know, there's this kind of selfie culture as well, add to that, that every now and then it kind of liberates you, that you don't need to incorporate, you know, references to a labyrinthine extent, and you can just let people follow their own line through references, and just on the other hand follow your own line, and that maybe lightens the load somewhat. It probably doesn't work for academic journals, I suspect, where you probably still have to get all your footnotes in place. But I sort of feel as though I'm tempted to put one little footnote you know, in future journal articles, which would be something like, okay, you can go away and write your own footnotes now, and just, you know, Google any references you like. So I'm not.
I was going to say the equivalent of let me Google that for you, or you know.
Yeah, it's like that, isn't it? Yeah. So I'm quite. Actually, there was a radio show I did not very long ago, which was a rather brilliant idea, which is to do with I've forgotten what it's called now. It seems rather appropriate, because it was to do with, you know, how to delete the archive, and indeed the producer of that radio show destroyed the radio show afterwards. I mean, ceremonially burnt it and deleted it from, so it's now unobtainable, because he was of the view that and indeed, Derrida has a good essay on this subject, actually, you know, something to do with why I hate the archive, or something like that, why the mania of the archive, the archive fever, I think it's translated as archive fever. You know, how we're all manically attached to, you know, preserving ourselves in some shape or form, probably as a, you know, struggle against death and annihilation and complete oblivion. But how, on the other hand, you know, it's nice to get away from it from time to time and just do something that cannot be archived or recorded or photographed or even remembered, perhaps.
Didn't Kafka want all of his works burned or something?
He did, didn't he? I wonder if that was that was genuine. I'm never been entirely sure, because he gives all his works to his best friend, and says, make sure you burn them. Okay, so I'm leaving them with you. All those great works of mine, make sure you burn them. But
PR,
I don't know. It's unclear. There's a degree of ambiguity there, because he could have popped them in the oven himself, you know.
And I'm mindful of, you mentioned again the selfie generation as well, and recently these calls for various social media platforms to say, you know, allowing people to delete any kind of things they've posted as children. Yeah, you know, to come back, because again, everything we're doing now, I think a lot of people are doing, is almost automatically archived, particularly when people are just living their lives through those kinds of devices and those kinds of platforms. Yeah, and there is a value to say, well, actually, do you want to be tied to everything that you've put out there? I know that's in the different context of people producing literature or producing pieces of work. Yeah. But there is something about, you know, our identity to some extent seems to be borne out in what are we leaving behind?
I know, yeah. So you're tied down to those specific markers or traces, to use one of those great Derridian words. And there is a funny little sort of graphic dramatization of that in Sartre's great work, Being a Nothingness, if you want me to mention that. Because he talks about the difference between skiing and surfing. Actually, he doesn't use the word surfing, but he's sort of implying it. And I rather like that. It's a short passage in Being a Nothingness. For anyone who wants to look it up, by the way, there's a footnote. It's around page 630 of the French edition of L'Être et le Néant. But he goes skiing with Simone de Beauvoir. This is the thing. De Beauvoir is the great skier. And she introduces Sartre to skiing when they should probably have been thinking of other things. It's kind of, you know, in the middle of 1930s, great crises and, you know, war looming, or probably already loomed, I should think, actually, in the case of the Spanish Civil War. But they go off skiing, and Sartre writes really interestingly about it, sort of uses it as a encapsulation of his philosophy in many ways. But he notes that, of course, one of the great things about skiing, particularly on a virgin slope, is you're leaving the trace of your passage through the snow. You're leaving your tracks. And this is something that we like to do. There's a whole magazine, for example, called Tracks. But he says that surely the ideal would be, and then he uses this nice phrase in French, le glissement sur l'eau, sliding on water, which I take to imply, at least implies surfing, but he also talks about water skiing. So the sliding on water, where the water folds back over your passage so that you appear to leave no trace. And it's a funny thing that in, you know, a kind of surveillance culture where we're insistent on privacy, at the same time we're insistent on complete publicity and leaving tracks everywhere, so that, you know where you are all the time, what you were doing, and so forth. And Sartre nevertheless says that, you know, that at some level there is still this ideal within us to do with a kind of nothingness in which you don't leave a trail, you don't leave tracks, and no one can follow. And you have that experience, you know, pure experience that has not been recorded and cannot be archived, but nevertheless you can speak of it. I wonder if you can still, you know, speak of that, you know, experience. Actually, this applies particularly to surfing now, which has become obsessed with, you know, if it wasn't videoed, it didn't happen. And I think that's rather sad.
And I was going to say, I mean, I must admit, I look at things. I'm very much about the self, not, you know, it's a narrative construct. You know, your past is your tracks, but you know, you're existentially free to kind of ignore them. And in a way, you know, that idea of them, you know, disappearing and going off in your own direction, regardless of what direction the tracks say to carry on in. I mean, that's, I must admit, how I kind of look at the self. You know.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, take that. So in a way, skiing is a bad metaphor, because the tracks continue. Whereas what you're saying is it should be more like, to use that other great favorite French philosopher of mine, Charles Fourier. You know, the butterfly passion. You should be able to, you know, fly away from your tracks and land somewhere else entirely and do something different. Yeah, that seems entirely reasonable. So you're not carrying on in the same groove. No, precisely. I think you should feel that. I hope one does feel that.
Where I think the skiing metaphor does work, though, as well, but we do have that momentum, don't we? So you're going in a certain direction. Whilst I think, if I'm understanding, when Louie has various times sort of reminded of this idea of where we're existentially free. So just because you happen to have been doing it that way up until this point doesn't mean you have to continue in that way. But the momentum you have makes it difficult, makes it a challenge to suddenly go, the next day it'll be something very, very different. And what I was taking from the Sartre quotes there is that he's implying then that there is this ideal of leaving no track. And is that necessarily the case? Is that necessarily preferable than leaving something behind? Because often actually people feel as though their place in the world is to somewhat measured by what they are leaving behind. Whether it's not necessarily a trace or something. Is that why people do write books and produce something to put out there to say, well, once I'm gone, that will still be there. That will be part of my legacy, part of my trace.
Yeah, I think there's that temptation. It's the inscription in the gravestone, isn't it? The epitaph that you want to leave behind in some way, but which I think is fine and it's kind of understandable. I mean, I like those very austere ones. Wittgenstein's gravestone, for example, just says Wittgenstein. I remember. There are great quotes. It's in Cambridge. It's very plain, very austere, very Bauhaus, I suppose. No great lines quoted from, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus or something, which you think would be a possibility. But I can see that. But there are a couple of thoughts that I've got on that. One to do with Sartre would be, that's fine, but does that count as a legacy for someone else? Is it pinning down someone else? And I particularly think in terms of transmission from parent to child, and perhaps this explains why Beauvoir and Sartre never wanted to have any children, for example. Perhaps because they feared precisely, the Larkin line springs to mind about your mum and dad fuck you up. They may not mean to, but they do. And I suppose this is the thing that Freud was particularly concerned with, the potential oppression of the father, so that you automatically want to bump off the father. And I can see that particularly, and there was one writer that I was speaking to recently who I thought was kind of brilliant, and I've read 3 of her books now, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is an ex-Muslim, which is quite a relative rarity and sometimes described as apostate. Because she was, or heretic indeed, and she's written a couple of books, 3 books, I think. One of which is entitled Heretic, but which is but the first one is Infidel, and which is partly to do with trying to overcome her heritage, I think, because she was brought up as a Muslim, and I think this would apply if you're brought up in any particular religion, or indeed any particular set of fairly clearly articulated beliefs, and in a belief system, so to speak, that there becomes a certain point where you want to transcend that or shake loose from that belief system. And that can sometimes be rather difficult. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali, this is a conversation I had with her not very long ago in Seattle, and people, if they wish, can look up that conversation. It's in an independent article. Which I think has got the word heretic in the title, possibly. But her minimum requirement, I would say, and this is where it brings me back to, I do think Sartre's great work, is the right to say no. And you probably remember that the whole opening section of Being in Nothingness is to do with the principle of negation, because he says quite interestingly that the great thing, a distinctive thing about human language or human activity is negation rather than creation. And the simple example he gives of that is how sitting in a cafe waiting for someone to turn up, Pierre, if I remember the case, and Pierre is late, so you're being stood up, and you're conscious that Pierre is not there, and he's got this nice line that the whole cafe becomes haunted by the absence of Pierre, and that whole consciousness of the negative and the ability to negate in sentences seems so fundamental. And you know, in other words, the ability to, in broadening out from there, to say, you know, no to your own heritage, or no to your father, no to God, no to anything and everything, seems to be, you know, the great, you know, universal human demand frequently, rather than to, yeah, okay, I need to sign up to such and such a thing. And I think she's got a good point there, which is a fundamentally existentialist point, the right to negation, or the ability of negation, really.
And there you go. I mean, that's silence.
Did that make sense?
No, absolutely, it absolutely made sense, Andy.
You can say no to that, of course.
No, I mean, I must admit, I'm more of the fuck you. So, you know, forget no, fuck you all. But I mean, that's just me. I'm a happy chappy, me. So, you know.
But that applies. That's what everyone should be able to say, I think, and feel good about it.
Now, I'm mindful of the time, so I think we should draw this episode to a close.
Brilliant.
Does it sound good to you, Matt? Yeah.
So there was that phrase "existentialism" I wanted to talk about, but maybe we save that for another time.
I think it's a good point to end on, actually. Yeah, that slightly intriguing phrase. That should perhaps be an independent word for the day, I think.
Well, there you go.
But can you talk us through it, or Louie, are we now kind of out of time, do you think?
I think, I mean, you know,
we're out of time.
Let's say, Andy, we'd love to have you back again at some time in the future. Don't feel you're signing up to any more, but
save that one up for the next episode.
We'll get you back on again in the future, and it's been a wonderful chatting to you. Thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure. In fact, I would say it's been pure Mudita.
Oh.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to say fuck you, but that's just because of me.
No, thank you,
Thanks,
Andy.
guys.
Thanks.
Really
Thanks,
appreciate
Andy.
it.
Okay, all right.
Speak
Take
to you
care.
again, I hope. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.